Everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how we capture the association between two quantitative variables. So in our last series of lectures, we talked about univariate descriptive statistics, how we analyze and summarize a single variable. In the next two lectures, we're going to be talking about moving into bivariate statistics. How do we describe how two variables are associated with one another? To start off, we're going to look at some graphical displays, specifically something called a scatter plot. So I'm going to start us off with a small data example, briefly describe what a scatter plot is, and then go through some examples of how we can start to get a visual understanding or summary of the potential association between two variables by looking at a scatter plot. Then we will transition into the more statistical side of it, and the primary statistic we're going to be looking at is known as R, or formerly Pearson's R. As you will see, Pearson's R actually has quite a few names. It's sort of the granddaddy of all correlation coefficients. So we will talk a little bit about what Pearson's R is, what are some of the properties of R, and then finally we're going to take a look at something called a correlation matrix. And a correlation matrix is a way where researchers can quickly show and display and summarize R values or correlation values between quite a few different variables. So we'll take a look at all of these. The readings that correspond with this particular lecture is Chapter 9, pages 311 through 330 of your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. What we see here is a data example. Similar to what we've done in prior lectures, we have to start off with some actual raw data to work with. So imagine that we are going into a prison and we have collected a sample of inmates who are currently somewhat in their 50s, right? 50 years old, 52 years old, something like that. So imagine we have a sample of incarcerated offenders and we collect two types of data from them. We collect age at which they were first arrested, thinking way back in their life. And also, now that they're sitting in prison in their 50s, how many criminal convictions have they compiled over their lifetime to date? Couple things to notice here. We are going to be looking not just at one variable at a time, as we did with the univariate analysis that we looked at in previous lectures. Rather, we're going to be looking to see whether or not these two variables are associated with one another. Do they move together in a predictable fashion? So, as you can see, we have our I case counter. We have 15 total cases in this data set. And another thing you'll notice is both of our variables are at that interval ratio level of measurement. Both age at first arrest as well as number of criminal convictions. If we had to say what level of measurement are they at, they're quantitative. They're at that interval ratio level of measurement. That is very important when we are looking at using the correlation coefficient R or working with scatter plots, as we're going to start to do. So keep that in mind, and I'll remind us about it in a few more moments. Here we have a scatter plot. And a scatter plot is the best way to sort of visually or graphically display association between two variables. So what's going on in this graphical display? Well, you'll notice in here, first of all, there's a bunch of little circles in this plot. Each one of these circles represents one of the 15 observations we saw in our data set from the previous slide. Now, how do we figure out who is who? Well, let's take a look at the X and Y axes. So when we look at the X axis down there on the bottom, we see our first variable, age at first arrest. And then sort of the spectrum of values that we see there, the range of values, indicate sort of the range of values that we saw when we looked at our previous slide of that actual data. Now, on the Y-axis, we have our second variable, which is number of criminal convictions. And the same idea, we have the values that were observed in our data. Now, the idea here is let's think back to what our previous slide told us. Our previous slide presented information from a sample of offenders who were in their 50s in prison, and we asked them, what was the age at which they were first arrested in life? And we also asked them how many criminal convictions had they compiled by the time they were in their 50s. And we think as researchers, okay, what kind of association might we see between age at first arrest and number of criminal convictions? And there are three types of associations that we're going to be seeing. One is a possibility of a positive association. Positive association means that people who have lower values for variable x are also likely to have lower values for variable y. And then moving up the scales, people with higher values for variable x are likely to have higher values for variable y. That's a positive association. Two variables move together and they both sort of move in the same direction. The other type of association is called a negative association. And it's still having two variables move together in a predictable fashion, but they're going in opposite directions of each other. So for a negative association, we would expect, on average, people who have lower values for variable x would have high values for variable y. And conversely, people who have high values for variable x would have low values for variable y. So they're still moving together in a predictable fashion, just in opposite directions. And finally, we can have pretty much a no association, where there doesn't seem to be any correlation between values for x as corresponding to values for y. And that's what a scatter plot helps us to capture. So let's take a look at our two variables and think what kind of association would make the most sense. If we're dealing with a group of people who are already in their 50s, and we think, okay, what might be the connection between age at first arrest and number of criminal convictions? Well, wouldn't it seem plausible that people who started their criminal career earlier in life, so had an earlier or a lower value for age at first arrest, had more time and probably more interaction with the criminal justice system, and therefore were more likely to compile a larger number of criminal convictions by the time they reach their 50s. And on the flip side, for people who didn't have their first arrest until later in life, don't have as much time or as much interaction with the system to compile a lot of convictions. So I would hypothesize that we would expect to see somewhat of a negative association between these two variables. And when we look at this plot, let's look at some of these dots, right? So each one of these dots, as I said, corresponds to one of the cases from the previous slide. So each dot, we would look at somebody's age at first arrest. And maybe I'm looking at one right now where the age of first arrest, there's a dot at just up above the 20. So somebody was 20 years old when they got their first arrest, and then we look at what their Y value is, and it looks like it's a 2. So the idea is we're just plotting. Each person has an X value, each person has a Y value, and then we plot them into this scatter plot. The next thing we're looking for visually is, can I draw a straight line to sort of represent the general slope of the two variables? So this is going to be one of the key things, and I'll show you on the next slide, that we look at in a scatter plot. We are looking at, and here's a key phrase, a straight line. What is a straight line? And then the second part, it has to be on a diagonal. So it has to have slope to it, either a positive slope or a negative slope. And I think, okay, what's the best straight line I could draw to summarize what I see here in this scatter plot? So let's take a look at that on the next slide. What I have done here is just drawn in, and this isn't mathematically done, I just sort of did a visual idea. I drew in a red line that I think does a decent job of sort of summarizing what I'm seeing with these data points in the scatter plot. And you'll notice I had to make sure it was a straight line. There can be no curves in it. It's got to be a straight line to summarize it. So this is not a perfect representation. I mean, obviously all the points aren't like perfectly on that line, but it is a pretty good summary of this type of association we see. And in fact, sort of consistent with our hypothesis, we notice that this straight line is on a diagonal and it has a negative slope. So this should be pretty indicative of a negative association between age at first arrest and number of criminal convictions for our sample. And in fact, I haven't mentioned it yet, and we'll talk about it in a couple slides, but if you look up at the top of this slide, right next to scatter plot, you'll notice I have an R equals negative 0.599. That is actually the R statistic for this association between these two variables. And as we'll see in a few moments, the fact that it is negative, the fact that it's got pretty good size given the range of R values that we'll talk about, we would say, yeah, this is a pretty decent negative association between these two variables. So let's look at just a few other examples of how scatter plots might help us to illustrate or see between positive associations, negative associations, and no associations. In this scatter plot, what you see here is, and this is just made up stuff, some sort of fictitious variable x on the x-axis, some fictitious variable y on the y-axis, and you'll notice here, if I said, please draw me a straight line and describe the slope of it and the type of association it represents, I think you would probably have a pretty easy job of recognizing that there is a nice positive slope here. And one of the things we capture in a scatter plot is what I call how tightly the dots cluster around the line that you would draw. Now on our previous slide, you saw that a lot of the spots were pretty far away from that red line that I put in there. Now if on this slide, if I were to try to draw a red line with a positive slope to sort of summarize what I'm seeing here, you can imagine all these dots would be a lot closer to that positively sloped line. And that is a sign of a stronger positive association. And so we'll notice here, and pay attention to the R value up there at the top of this slide. Even though we haven't talked about R a whole lot, keep it in mind for a couple slides ahead. So you'll notice here that the R is a positive value, so it's indicative of a positive association, and it's 0.952. And I'll tell you right now, that is a very high value for R. It's a very strong value for R because R can't go above 1. And you're going to see that the values of R are limited between -1 and +1. So the fact that this R value is pretty close to the top of that end, pretty close to +1, that's a pretty strong positive association. In this slide, what I've done is pretty much just turned everything on its head, right? This is sort of the reverse of what we saw on the previous slide. Now we have, once again, if I said draw a sloped straight line to represent it, you could probably do a pretty good job of drawing a straight line to summarize what you're seeing with these dots here, and it would have a nice negative slope to it, and the dots would probably cluster pretty tightly around that line. And sure enough, that is reflected up there at the top where we see that the correlation coefficient, the R value, would in fact be a negative 0.952. So the negative is going to tell us that we have a negative association, exactly what we see in the scatter plot with that negative slope, and the dots cluster pretty tightly around that line, and that's why our value of negative 0.952 is in fact a pretty strong negative association because it's close to the lowest possible values of R, which are -1. Finally, we have a situation where if we look at this and I said, okay, I want you to draw me a sloped straight line, either positive or negative slope, that represents this cluster of dots or this spread of dots. I imagine a lot of us would be going, oh man, I'm looking at it. Is it positive slope? Is there no slope? Is it a negative slope? It's a little bit harder here, right? Because this looks more just like a cloud of, it's like scattershot. There's no real story or pattern that we can clearly see here. Values, we've got low values of X corresponding to both low values of Y and high values of Y, high values of X that are corresponding to low and high values of Y. Things are all over the map. Well, sure enough, if we were to actually see this, we would probably think, I don't think there's much of an association going on between these two variables. And as you can see up at the top, a hint for where we're going once we turn the page and go into the statistics side of association, you'll see that the R value is negative 0.033. So that's pretty close to zero. And in fact, you'll realize that when there is little to no association between variables, the R value will be really close to zero. Okay, so what we have seen here on the last few slides is sort of the glimpse that we often like to do as researchers. We like to look at a scatter plot to see, do we see some sort of obvious pattern with our variables? And sometimes we'll see an obvious negative, sometimes we'll see an obvious positive association. Sometimes we'll see what we see on this slide where we can't really discern whether or not there is any association between the two variables. And then other times we'll actually notice other little issues or errors that may have an influence on our actual statistics. We'll talk more about those issues or errors when we get into part 2 of this lecture series. So we'll save that one for the next one. But now let's go ahead and transition away from the graphical display, the scatter plots, and look at the actual statistics that we would use to capture linear association between two quantitative variables. So the correlation coefficient that we use as statisticians is known as Pearson's R. Pearson's R goes by many names. The Pearson correlation coefficient, Pearson's R, the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, the zero order correlation coefficient, the bivariate correlation coefficient, right? So there's a lot of names, but they all refer to Pearson's R. The symbol that we will typically see when we see an article or a research report or a textbook that describes this particular statistic is simply the lowercase letter r. And whenever you see that, you know, aha, this is a statistic that is measuring the linear association between two quantitative variables. And that is in fact exactly what it does. So keep that in mind. It only captures linear correlation. Remember, I talked about the importance of a straight line when we were looking at those scatter plots. And also, both of the variables have to be at that interval ratio level of measurement. They both have to be quantitative variables. If you have variables that are at other levels of measurement, like nominal or ordinal, there are other types of correlation or association coefficients that you can use. And we'll look at those a little bit more detail in our next lecture. But for right now, we're going to focus primarily on sort of the gold standard or the granddaddy of correlation coefficients, and that is Pearson's R. So let's take a look at some of the properties of R. First of all, R, the correlation coefficient, has a limited or finite range of values that can occur. So looking at my little graphic here, the lowest possible value for Pearson's R is a -1. The highest possible value for Pearson's R is a +1. So whenever you ask SPSS or any other software program to compute Pearson's R for your data or examining the association between two variables, the value will be somewhere between -1 and +1. If somebody comes up to you and says, oh yeah, we ran Pearson's R for the association between variables X and Y, and we got a value of 2.89, immediately your ears should pick up and go, that doesn't make sense, because 2.89 is not a possible value for R. It's got to be between -1 and +1. All right. The next thing we can look at once we are given an R statistic is whether we get a negative value or a positive value. That tells us the direction of association. It tells us the type of association we're seeing with these two variables. So, and this is kind of nice and cut and dry. If you ask SPSS to compute Pearson's R for the association between two variables, and if the value is negative, so basically if it's less than 0 all the way down to -1, if there's a negative value, that tells you that the type of association between the two variables is negative, period. That's it. If the R value that is produced for you is greater than 0 up to a +1, you know that you have a positive association between the two variables. So Negative or positive doesn't tell us anything about strength. No, no, no. This is not about strength. This is simply the negative or positive sign simply tells us the type of association or the direction of association that we see between the variables. And then obviously, as we get closer, or the closer that an R statistic is to that center point of the range of values, closer to zero, that is indicative of little to no association between the two variables. Let's move on to adding in that next layer. So once we figure out in step 2, we figure out what type of association we have. But obviously we also want to know what kind of strength of the association do we have. Strength, another word that we often see in statistics, is they use the word magnitude. So what is the magnitude of association? Okay, well, magnitude is sort of, a mirror image on the positive and the negative side. So you can have strong negative associations and you can have strong positive. You can have weak negative and weak positive, right? So, but how do we figure out our magnitude or strength of association? Well, in the simplest sense, the closer your R value is, the closer the value of the correlation coefficient happens to be to the ends of the range of values. So the closer the value is to either -1 or +1, the stronger the association. The closer your R value is to 0, the weaker the association. So what you see here is if we think about the range or the magnitude of values, the closer you are to -1, you have very strong negative associations. If you're somewhere in the middle between -1 and 0, you're kind of in that medium negative association. As you get closer to 0, the association is weak. Once you move over to the positive side, if you're somewhere between 0 and +1, sort of in the middle, you have a medium positive association. And then finally, as you get closest to that +1 out there, you have a strong positive association. Okay, so a couple things to take away. Number one, and first and foremost, is I'm talking about R values. I showed you with those scatter plots some of the R values up at the tops of those slides, but have I shown you a formula for R? No, I have not. Now, it's not a very hard formula to hand compute an R statistic yourself, but for the sake of this course, we are going to rely on software programs like SPSS to compute the Pearson correlation coefficients for us. So for us, I don't want you worrying about thinking about how do I compute R by hand. We have enough technology and computers out there that can do it much quicker and with perfect accuracy. So we want to get used to understanding and interpreting R statistics once a computer software program has produced them for us. So that's the first thing. The second thing, let's go back to step 3, which is that magnitude of association. So you'll see I see ranges from strong to medium to weak to medium to strong. Some of us may go, well, at what point do I deviate or change from a strong association to a medium? Or at what point do I move from a medium to a weak? Is positive 0.3 medium? Is that weak? I don't know. Well, here's my takeaway on that. Depending upon the nature of the variables that you're looking at, where we would draw the line between a weak association, a medium, or a strong association changes. And in fact, in a lot of textbooks, ours included, will have different sort of breakdowns of what is a weak versus a medium versus a strong association or strong value for R. Some of them are from the statisticians, the Cohens. But for the sake of this class, once again, because it changes depending upon what you're studying. Now, if I'm in sort of the physical sciences and I'm doing a very controlled experiment, then I may be looking for associations that are much closer to negative or +1 in order to consider them strong. Or if I'm doing some sort of reliability assessment, I'm looking for things that are really strong. But when we're looking at humans and all the things that go into human behavior, sometimes an R value of 0.3 is something to jump up and shout about, right? So it depends upon the phenomenon that you're studying. So rather than giving you sort of a line in the sand to say, this is what is a weak association, this is what is medium, this is what is strong, etc., What I'd rather have you think about is using our R statistics more in a comparative sense. So if one study found an R value between two variables of 0.48, and then in another study that also examined the association between those two variables or similar variables found an R value of 0.64, well, that 0.64 is a higher value than 0.48. So we can say that study 2 with the 0.64 found a stronger association than study 1. So that's what I want you to be able to be comfortable with, is sort of that comparative sense of how do I interpret an R value. So I need to know that the range of possible values is fixed between negative and positive 1. The second thing that I should be aware of if I'm giving an R statistic is what type or what direction of association is going on. Is it negative? Is it positive? Or is there nothing? And then finally, have a general sense if I'm asked to compare one R statistic against another, which one is stronger, which one is weaker. That's kind of what the takeaway that I want you to understand for this course. Okay, a couple other sort of wrap-up things about properties of Pearson's R before we look at how they're often displayed in research reports and articles. And this is step 4. So step 4, I've said this multiple times, but just to make sure we've got it in our notes and we don't forget about it, Pearson's R only captures a linear relationship. It does not capture what we call curvilinear relationships, so sort of quadratic type terms or parabolas or things of that nature, or even S-type relationships that may occur. And we'll talk more about those in the next lecture. But R in its raw form only captures that linear relationship. It's looking for the best straight sloped line to capture the association between the two variables. Also, R is what we call a standardized statistic. So standardized meaning that there's no dimensions, there's no units with it, right? When we talked about going back to our descriptive statistics for a single variable, we talked about the mean. And the mean was in the units. If it was number of prior arrests and the mean was 5, then you would say that the mean was 5 prior arrests. Same thing with standard deviation and measures of variability. Well, when we look at R, because we are comparing two variables, and oftentimes they're in different units, like thinking back to our first example in this lecture, we had age at first arrest, which would be in years, those are the units, and then we had number of criminal convictions, which would be a count, number of convictions. So we have 2 units. So how do we merge those together when we measure association? The good news is we don't, because we compute Pearson's R, a standardized statistic, so it has no dimensions. So therefore, there are no units when we look at Pearson's R. It is just, the number is the number, and you interpret it similar to, based upon what we see in steps 1, 2, and 3 on this slide. But a good thing that having it dimensionless and standardized is that it makes it comparable across different studies and samples. So if I'm doing work in the US and maybe we're measuring, say, sentence length in days or something like that, and then another study in Europe is looking at sentence length, but they measure it in months. Doesn't matter. We don't have to go back and go, one measured it in different units, days versus months. Doesn't matter. We can still compare the R statistics, the association statistics that were found across different studies, right? So if you're measuring things, if one study is measuring distance in miles and another is measuring distance in kilometers, that doesn't matter because of the fact that R is standardized. You can compare your findings across different studies and samples to figure out what we were talking about with step 3. Did we find a stronger association in one study versus another? Did we find a weaker association, etc.? Okay, one more slide for this particular lecture, and this is going to be about once we ask SPSS, we've got our data, we've entered in and we've looked at our scatter plots and we've asked SPSS or some other software program to compute some R statistics, how do we display them to our audience? And how we display them to our audience is typically known as a correlation coefficient. So what we have here is, imagine I do a study where I go out and I collect 3 pieces of information. So I collect age at first arrest, variable X, number of convictions, variable Y, but I also add in a third variable, current sentence length. So say for our what we started with, that sample of individuals in their 50s, if I added in that third variable, which is what is your current sentence length? Now you can imagine there's multiple bivariate or 2 variable associations I may want to examine. I want to see, is there an association between age at first arrest and number of convictions? But also I can look at, is there an association between age at first arrest and current sentence length? Is there an association between number of convictions and current sentence length, right? So we start, as you add in more variables, more quantitative variables into a study, the number of possible bivariate associations starts to grow very quickly. And the best way to capture that in a nice, simplistic, concise manner is known as a correlation matrix. So in a correlation matrix, the values in the cells of the matrix represent the correlation coefficient value for the 2 variables that it matches up with. So looking at our small correlation matrix here, you'll notice that across the very top, we have 3 variables: age at first arrest, number of convictions, and current sentence length. If we look down that very first column, the variable names in black, we see the same names: age at first arrest, number of convictions, and current sentence length. So why am I repeating the same variables? Well, because then we use the columns and rows to match each cell, and each cell represents the correlation between the variable whose row it's in, as well as the variable whose column it's in. So let's find the correlation between number of convictions and age at first arrest. So there's 2 places on this correlation matrix that you can find that value, because a correlation matrix does repeat information. Okay, so I'm going to find that by looking first across the very top row, and there in white where it says number of convictions. I'm going to focus now on that column. I need to go from that column, number of convictions, and go down to pick one of the 3 cells below it that corresponds with age at first arrest. And sure enough, it is the second row down that says age at first arrest. I go over and match that under of number of convictions, and I see an R value of negative 0.60. So that negative 0.60 is in fact our R, our Pearson correlation coefficient. The fact that it's negative tells me that there is a negative association between number of convictions and age at first arrest. That's all I need to know. There's no math I need to do, nothing. I just need to know that each one of those little values in each one of those cells is an R statistic. Done. Okay, so let's take a look and scrutinize this a little bit closer. You'll notice on what we call the diagonal, sort of like a negatively sloped diagonal, you see ones. You see, when you look at the connection between age at first arrest and then age at first arrest, so the column and row for age at first arrest, you see a perfect 1.00. You also see a 1.00 when you match number of convictions and number of convictions. And finally, down there in the lower right-hand corner, you see a 1.00 when you match current sentence length with current sentence length. Well, why is that? Well, it's because those are sort of just mathematical leftovers, like vestigial structures that when you run a correlation matrix, it's going to tell you that the association between any variable and itself is going to be a perfect one, right? If I know the age at which you were first arrested, I can predict the age at which you were first arrested, right? So there's a perfect correlation between any variable and itself. So for us as readers, if you ever look at an article or a book or a research report and they have left those ones on that diagonal in a correlation matrix, just ignore them. So I'll say that one more time. Those 1.00s on the diagonal, just ignore them. They are simply an artifact of the statistics when you ask a computer program to run it, and it's showing you that the correlation between any variable and itself is going to be perfect. That doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us about 2 different variables, all that sort of stuff. So ignore those ones. But the good news is, when you see those ones on a diagonal, you even if there's no heading to that table or that chart, you know, aha, I'm looking at a correlation matrix. And that's kind of what it gives you. Another thing we'll notice is if you look at sort of the upper, like the cells that are sort of the upper right-hand corner versus the cells that are the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that the same numbers get repeated. So that negative 0.60 shows up in two different cells. Why? Because it's the same two variables. It just shows up in two different places within the correlation matrix. So we see that negative 0.60, when you match the rows and column names that correspond with it, you see age at first arrest and number of convictions. Same thing when you see the value of 0.32. It shows up in two different cells. Why? Because it's showing the exact same association. The one between age at first arrest and current sentence length. It just matters whether or not it's in the rows or columns that the variables are listed. Okay, so we do see some redundancy and repetition. And in fact, sometimes you will see a correlation matrix printed in an article or a report where those repetition or redundant numbers are like half of them are just removed. So it looks, rather than like a full set of like what we have here are 9 cells with numbers in them, you may have only even as little as only 3 cells that really capture the true information. The ones could be removed, and any of the redundant values could also be removed. But I just want to see you sort of in its raw form what a correlation matrix looks like. So finally, before we wrap up this lecture, let's talk quickly about what are the couple of the things that I could take away, like thinking back to the properties of R. Well, the first thing I could ask you is, which two variables have the strongest association? So what you're looking for, if I'm talking about strength or magnitude, you're going, okay, I don't care about positive and negatives. I'm just looking for the value that has an absolute value closest to 1. And you look around, you go, aha, there it is. Remember, do not focus on the 1.00s. No, no, no. Those tell us nothing. Instead, I'm looking at one of those other ones and I go, okay, there it is. 0.64. 0.64 is greater than 0.32. And the absolute value of 0.64 is greater than that 0.60, the negative one that we saw. So I would say the strongest association occurs between number of convictions and current sentence length, because those are the rows and columns that match and get me to that 0.64 cell. Or I could reverse it and say that the strongest association is between current sentence length and number of convictions. I'm saying the exact same thing, I'm just changing the order of the variables. It does not matter. If I would say, which two variables have the weakest association? Okay, so I'm thinking weak. Weak once again, is not about positive or negative. Weak is all about the absolute value that is the closest to 0. So I go, okay, there's a negative 0.6, there's a 0.64, and then, oh, there's the smallest one, that's 0.32. So the weakest association is between age at first arrest and current sentence length. And then I could also ask something like, for which two variables is there a negative association? And I go, okay, now I'm just looking not for strength, I'm simply looking for a negative sign. And I go, okay, there it is, that negative 0.60, and the association is between age at first arrest and number of convictions. Okay, so if you're thinking about a correlation matrix, and do not be intimidated by it. The questions that I just went over are about as complex as you're going to get when trying to break down a correlation matrix. But oftentimes if people aren't very familiar with the R statistics or have never seen one, they get a little intimidated. They think that they need to do some sort of math. No, all you have to do is based upon what you're looking for, the strongest associations, the weakest associations, positives, negatives, things like that, then you can understand and interpret a correlation matrix. So we'll wrap up this lecture for here. Our next lecture will be part 2 of examining associations between two quantitative variables. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about, one, what are some of the factors that may sort of falsely influence the value of R, which is why it's so important to use both scatter plots as well as actually getting the R statistic itself in order to make sure that your findings and data and your statistics are accurate. So we'll see that in the next PowerPoint. We'll also introduce something which is really fancy. It's our first sort of measure of strength of association, which is known as a coefficient of determination. So we'll talk about that, and then also give a brief glimpse into some other types of correlation coefficients that are used when both variables are not at that quantitative level of measurement. So I look forward to seeing you with that one. So take care and have a good day.